If you're enjoying stories like this, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, have you ever met someone who completely changed the way you see the world? Because that's exactly what happened in this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. She threw up again. Nathan Blackwell stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, his tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast against the pale pink walls covered in butterfly stickers. His jaw was tight. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the third call from his CFO in 10 minutes. But for once he didn't reach for it. Sophie lay curled on her side, her small body wrapped around a stuffed rabbit, her face the color of old paper. She was 6 years old, 42 pounds, and she looked like she was disappearing. When? Nathan asked, his voice low. 20 minutes ago, Margaret Blackwell answered from the rocking chair beside the bed. His mother sat perfectly upright, her silver hair pinned in its usual elegant twist, her expression carved from the same granite as the Blackwell family estate in Beacon Hill. I cleaned her up. She's resting now. Nathan crossed the room and knelt beside the bed. He pressed the back of his hand to Sophie's forehead. Cool, clammy. His chest tightened in a way that no boardroom crisis had ever managed. This is the 4th time this week, he said quietly. I'm aware. Margaret's tone carried the weight of someone who had buried a husband, built a fortune, and raised a son alone, all without ever raising her voice. Dr. Chen adjusted her medication yesterday. He said it takes time. Time. Nathan repeated the word like it tasted bitter. He'd spent $300,000 on specialists in the past 4 months. Gastroenterologists, allergists, pediatric neurologists. They'd run every test modern medicine could invent, and the answer was always the same. Nothing conclusive. Stress, possibly. Anxiety. A sensitive stomach. His daughter was 6. What exactly was she supposed to be stressed about? He stood up, buttoned his jacket. A habit, a reflex, the armor he wore against everything he couldn't control, and walked to the window. The Boston skyline glittered in the early evening, the harbor catching the last copper light of October. Somewhere down there, his company was in the middle of a $2 billion acquisition. Somewhere up here, his little girl couldn't keep her dinner down. The new nanny starts tomorrow, he said without turning around. Margaret's silence was louder than any objection. Mother, I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. He turned to face her. This is the 5th nanny in 8 months. Sophie needs consistency. Sophie needs her father. Margaret stood, smoothing the front of her cream cashmere cardigan. Not another stranger with a resume and a smile. I interviewed this one myself. You interviewed the last one yourself, and she lasted 3 weeks before Victoria found her reorganizing the wine cellar at midnight. Nathan exhaled through his nose. Victoria, his fiancée of 11 months, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her talent for finding fault in every woman who entered his household under the age of 50. Claire Morgan comes highly recommended, he said. She has experience with children who have medical needs. That's what matters. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then glanced at Sophie's sleeping form. Something softened behind her eyes. Not much, just enough to remind Nathan that beneath the formidable exterior, his mother loved that child more than anything left in this world. Fine, Margaret said, but if this one can't handle Victoria, don't expect me to referee. She left the room with the quiet authority of a woman who had never needed to slam a door to make her point. Nathan sat on the edge of Sophie's bed. The little girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open, brown, like her mother's, the only inheritance from a woman who had walked out when Sophie was 14 months old and never looked back. Daddy? Hey, butterfly. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. How's the tummy? It's angry again. He smiled despite everything. Well, tell it I'm going to have a very serious talk with it. Sophie giggled, a small, fragile sound that cracked something inside him. You can't talk to a tummy, Daddy. Watch me. I've negotiated with senators and shareholders. A tummy should be easy. She smiled and closed her eyes. Nathan stayed until her breathing evened out, then stood and walked to the hallway. His phone buzzed again. He answered it this time. Tell Richardson the meeting moves to Thursday, he said. I'm not available tomorrow morning. He ended the call before his CFO could argue and leaned against the wall, staring at nothing. Somewhere across the city, in a one-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, Claire Morgan was ironing her only white blouse and trying to convince herself that tomorrow would be different, that this time the job would stick, that the past was the past, and it couldn't reach her anymore. She was wrong about that last part, but she didn't know it yet. Claire arrived at the Blackwell residence at exactly 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes early, because punctuality was one of the few luxuries that cost nothing. The house was not a house. It was a statement, a 4-story brownstone on Louisburg Square that looked like it had been plucked from a period film and polished until it gleamed. Iron railings, gas lanterns, windows so clean they seemed to not exist at all. She pressed the doorbell and straightened her blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a simple low bun. No jewelry except for a thin silver chain her grandmother had given her, the only thing she'd kept from her previous life. The door opened, and a woman who was not Nathan Blackwell stood before her. Victoria Lane was the kind of beautiful that made other women instinctively check their posture. Honey blonde hair that fell in effortless waves, a cream silk blouse tucked into high-waisted trousers, cheekbones that could have been engineered by a sculptor with a personal vendetta against ordinary faces. "You must be the new girl," Victoria said, looking Claire up and down with the practiced efficiency of someone evaluating merchandise. "Claire Morgan. I'm here for the nanny position." "Yes, I know." Victoria stepped aside, gesturing inward with a manicured hand. "Nathan's in his study. I'll take you." Claire followed her through a foyer that smelled like fresh lilies and old money. Her sneakers were silent on the marble floor. She noticed everything: the Rothko on the wall, the spiral staircase, the way the morning light fell through the transom window and turned the dust motes into tiny floating stars. Victoria walked quickly, heels clicking a sharp rhythm. "A few things before you meet Nathan. Sophie is delicate. She has stomach issues, as I'm sure you were told. She doesn't do well with change, so try not to be too enthusiastic." "Understood." "Also, the kitchen is off limits after 8 p.m. The 3rd floor is Nathan's private office. No access without permission. And I manage the household schedule, so any requests go through me." Claire noted the territorial markers being laid down like a fence line. She said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence was often the smartest response. Victoria stopped at a heavy oak door and knocked twice. "Nathan, your new nanny is here." The door opened. Nathan Blackwell in person was different from the photos Claire had found online during her research. In photographs, he looked polished, controlled, the kind of man who existed behind glass. In person, standing in the doorway of his study with his sleeves rolled to his elbows and shadows under his eyes, he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. "Miss Morgan." He extended his hand. His grip was firm, brief, professional. "Thank you for coming early." "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. Nathan is fine." He stepped back to let her in. The study was all dark wood and leather, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a massive desk covered in papers. A framed photo of Sophie sat at the corner, the only personal item in the room. "I'll leave you to it," Victoria said from the doorway, her smile precise and empty. She closed the door behind her. Nathan gestured to a chair. Claire sat. He remained standing, leaning against the edge of his desk. A power position she recognized. Probably unconscious. Probably not. "I've read your file," he began. "You worked at 3 families in the past 2 years. Good references, all of them. I appreciate thoroughness, Mr. Blackwell." Nathan. He studied her for a moment. "My daughter is sick. The doctors can't figure out why. She needs someone who pays attention, not just to schedules and meals, but to her, to what she's feeling. Can you do that?" Claire met his gaze. Behind the executive composure, she saw something she recognized, the desperate helplessness of a parent watching their child suffer and being unable to fix it. "I can," she said simply. "Good." He straightened. "Margaret, my mother. She'll show you the house. Sophie's room is on the 2nd floor. She usually wakes around 8. Claire stood, sensing the meeting was over. "Miss Morgan." He stopped her at the door. "The last 4 nannies quit. I need someone who stays." She turned and looked at him. Really looked past the suit and the jaw and the carefully constructed authority. "I don't quit, Nathan. That's one thing you should know about me." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest spark of belief. She left the study and closed the door behind her. In the hallway, she exhaled slowly and pressed her hand against her chest, where her heart was beating faster than it should have been. Not because of him, not because of those eyes that were green one moment and gray the next, or the way his voice dropped when he talked about his daughter. Not because of any of that, because Sophie Blackwell was 6 years old and sick, and Claire had seen something in the file that no one else had noticed. A pattern. A detail so small it could have been nothing. But Claire Morgan had spent 3 years as a pediatric resident at Johns Hopkins before her world collapsed, and she knew in her bones, that it wasn't nothing. Sophie Blackwell had her father's stubbornness and her own particular brand of quiet courage. Claire discovered this within the first hour. "I don't like oatmeal," Sophie announced from her bed, staring at the tray Margaret had prepared with the intensity of a tiny food critic. "That's okay," Claire said, sitting in the chair beside her. "What do you like?" "Toast with the crust cut off and apple juice." "But Victoria says apple juice has too much sugar." "What does your dad say?" Sophie considered this. "Daddy says I can have whatever I want as long as I eat something." "Sounds like a reasonable man." "He's very busy." Sophie said this without complaint, without sadness, simply as fact, the way children state truths they've absorbed so deeply they no longer feel them. "He has a big company." "I know." Claire leaned forward. "But I bet he'd rather be here with you." Sophie looked at her with those dark brown eyes. Enormous, too knowing for 6. "How do you know that?" "Because when he talked about you yesterday, his whole face changed." Sophie smiled. It was small and quick, like a bird landing on a branch and taking off again, but it was real. Claire decided right then that she would figure out what was wrong with this child, no matter what it took. The first 3 days were observation. Claire watched everything. What Sophie ate, when she ate, how she felt before and after meals, what times the pain came, what preceded it. She carried a small notebook in her apron pocket and recorded every detail. She also watched the household. Margaret Blackwell ran the domestic operations with military precision. Meals were prepared by a private chef named Thomas who came 3 times a week. On other days, Margaret cooked herself, simple, wholesome dishes that Sophie barely touched. Victoria oversaw the social calendar and, as far as Claire could tell, spent most of her time planning events, shopping, and making phone calls that required her to leave the room. Nathan was a ghost. He left before 7, returned after 8, and spent the hours between in a world Claire could only glimpse through the study door. Late-night calls, the blue glow of his laptop, the occasional sound of his voice, low and controlled, negotiating something that always seemed urgent. But every night, without fail, he went to Sophie's room. Claire heard him through the wall. Her room was next door on the 2nd floor, reading stories, asking about her day, singing a song that sounded like it might have been made up on the spot with questionable melody and lyrics that rhymed butterfly with pizza pie. On the 4th morning, Claire found something. She was reviewing Sophie's meal log when a pattern emerged. The stomach pains were worse on specific days. Not random, not stress-related, but tied to a particular variable that Claire had been tracking without even realizing she was looking for it. The pain was worst on days when Victoria prepared Sophie's afternoon snack. Thomas cooked most meals. Margaret handled breakfast. But Victoria had taken over the afternoon snack. A smoothie, she said, made with organic fruits and probiotics. She'd started making them about 5 months ago, around the same time Sophie's symptoms had intensified. Claire stared at her notebook. Her hands were steady, but something cold was spreading through her chest. It could be coincidence. Organic fruit could be causing a reaction. Maybe Sophie had a sensitivity to something in the smoothie. Or maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Claire closed the notebook and slipped it into her pocket. She needed more data before she could say anything. She needed to be absolutely certain because accusations like the one forming in her mind didn't just ripple, they detonated. That afternoon she was in the kitchen when Nathan came home early. She heard his voice before she saw him. On the phone, sharp and clipped. The tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I don't care what the contractors say. The deadline doesn't move." He walked into the kitchen still talking, stopped when he saw Claire at the counter, and held up one finger in a gesture that was both an apology and a command. She waited, drying a glass she'd already dried twice. He ended the call and set his phone on the counter. "Miss Morgan." "Claire." "Claire." He opened the refrigerator, stared inside as if expecting it to present a solution, then closed it. "How's Sophie today?" "Better. She ate most of her lunch." She drew a picture of a purple horse with wings. A Pegasus. She called it Gerald. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. Of course she did. He leaned against the counter, and for a moment the executive dissolved and what remained was just a tired father in a very expensive kitchen. "The specialists want to run more tests next week," he said. "Another round of blood work and endoscopy." Claire set down the glass. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How long has Victoria been making Sophie's afternoon smoothies?" He frowned. 4, 5 months? She read some article about gut health and probiotics. Why? "Just trying to understand Sophie's routine. The more I know about what she consumes, the better I can track her symptoms." Nathan studied her. She could feel him analyzing her the way he probably analyzed quarterly reports, looking for the data beneath the surface, the number that didn't add up. "You're very thorough for a nanny," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite a question. "I prefer to think of it as being attentive," she replied evenly, "which is literally what you hired me for." There it was again, that twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Fair point, Claire." He picked up his phone and started to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Sophie showed me the picture. Gerald, the purple Pegasus. He's quite majestic. She said you helped her with the wings. I may have contributed some artistic direction." Nathan looked at her, really looked, the way he had during her interview, except this time there was something warmer behind it, something that made her grip the edge of the counter just a little tighter. "Thank you," he said, "for paying attention." He left. Claire stood in the kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade, and reminded herself firmly that noticing the exact shade of green in a man's eyes was not part of her job description, but she noticed anyway. And it bothered her that she couldn't stop. The weekend brought two things: Victoria's charity gala planning committee, which invaded the house like a perfumed army, and Sophie's worst episode yet. It happened Saturday afternoon. Claire was reading to Sophie in the sunroom when the little girl suddenly went pale, clutched her stomach and began to cry. Not the dramatic tears of a child seeking attention, but the quiet, desperate crying of someone in genuine pain. Claire moved fast. She checked Sophie's temperature, her pulse, pressed gently on her abdomen. The pain was concentrated in the upper region. Epigastric, her medical training supplied automatically, and Sophie was nauseous but not vomiting. "It's okay, Butterfly," Claire murmured, using Nathan's nickname without thinking. "I'm right here. Can you tell me what you had to eat today?" Just breakfast, and the smoothie Victoria made." Claire's blood went cold. She got Sophie settled on the couch with a warm compress on her stomach and a glass of plain water. Then she went to the kitchen. The blender was in the sink, recently rinsed. Beside it, on the counter, was a small glass jar with a handwritten label, "Probiotic Blend. Sophie." Claire picked it up. The powder inside was fine, slightly off-white. She unscrewed the lid and smelled it, faintly bitter, not unpleasant, but not like any probiotic supplement she'd ever encountered. She took a photo of the label with her phone. Then she put the jar back exactly where she'd found it. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the cold clinical fury of someone who has seen what happens to children when the adults around them fail to look closely enough. She needed proof. A photo wasn't enough. She needed that powder analyzed. But first, she needed to keep Sophie safe. And she needed to do it without alerting anyone to what she suspected, because if she was right, if Victoria Lane was deliberately adding something to a 6-year-old's food, then Claire was standing in the middle of something far more dangerous than a household disagreement. She returned to the sunroom. Sophie had stopped crying and was watching the trees through the window with the exhausted patience of a child who had learned to wait for pain to pass. "Claire?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are you going to leave too? Like the other nannies?" Claire sat down and took Sophie's small hand in hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie, I promise." The little girl's fingers tightened around hers, and Claire felt the weight of that promise settle into her bones. She would keep it, no matter what it cost her. Monday morning brought cold rain and a conversation Claire had been dreading. She needed to tell Nathan what she suspected. But telling Nathan meant revealing how she'd arrived at her conclusions. The systematic observation, the pattern recognition, the medical knowledge that a nanny wasn't supposed to have. It meant peeling back the carefully constructed identity she'd built over the past 2 years and exposing the woman underneath. Dr. Claire Morgan, Johns Hopkins pediatric resident, class of 2019. Top of her cohort, published researcher, the kind of doctor attending physicians described as once in a generation, until the night everything shattered. She'd been 26. A patient, a 3-year-old boy named Elijah, had been brought into the emergency department with symptoms that didn't add up. Claire had pushed for additional testing against the attending's orders. She'd been right. The child had a rare metabolic condition that would have killed him within 48 hours if undiagnosed. But being right wasn't enough. The attending, Dr. Marcus Webb, a man whose reputation was as fragile as his ego, had rewritten the narrative. He claimed Claire had acted recklessly, ordered unauthorized tests, and endangered the patient. He filed a formal complaint. The hospital, protecting its star physician and its liability, sided with Webb. Claire's residency was terminated. Her appeal was denied. The medical board launched an investigation that, while it ultimately found no wrongdoing, left a stain on her record that no hospital would touch. In medicine, suspicion was as good as conviction. She lost her career, she lost her apartment, she lost the fiancé who'd said he loved her, but apparently only loved the idea of marrying a doctor. Within 6 months, she'd gone from a woman with a brilliant future to a woman ironing her only white blouse in a studio apartment, applying for nanny positions because she still needed to be near children, still needed to help, still needed to feel that the skills she'd spent her entire adult life building weren't worthless. Now she sat in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the photo of the probiotic jar on her phone, and faced a terrible choice. If she told Nathan and she was wrong, she'd lose this job and any chance of working in childcare again. A nanny accusing a billionaire's fiancé of poisoning his daughter? That wasn't a mistake you recovered from. If she told Nathan and she was right, she'd have to explain how she knew. And then the questions would come. Who are you really? What are you hiding? Why did you lie on your application? And if she said nothing, Sophie would keep getting sicker. There was no version of this where Claire came out unscathed. She had known that since Saturday, when she'd held Sophie's hand and made a promise she intended to keep. The kitchen door opened. Nathan stood there in running clothes, his hair damp from the rain, breathing slightly hard. He stopped when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep?" He poured himself water from the filter and leaned against the counter. In the gray morning light, without the armor of his suit, he looked younger, vulnerable, like a man instead of a CEO. "Sophie had a good night," he offered. "No episodes." "I know, I checked on her at 2. He looked at her. "You check on her at 2 in the morning?" "She sometimes wakes up with pain and doesn't call for anyone. She just lies there and waits for it to pass." Claire paused. She shouldn't have to do that alone. Nathan set down his glass. Something shifted in his expression, the controlled executive giving way to something rawer, something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with shame. "I didn't know she did that," he said quietly. "Children adapt to what they think is expected of them. Sophie thinks being brave means being silent. She gets that from me." "I know." They looked at each other across the kitchen. The rain tapped against the windows. The refrigerator hummed. And in that small, quiet moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with employer and employee. A recognition, a resonance, the sense of two people seeing each other clearly for the first time. Nathan broke the gaze first. He ran a hand through his wet hair and cleared his throat. "I should shower, board meeting at 9. "Nathan." He stopped. "I need to talk to you about something, about Sophie, but not right now. Tonight, when you have time. It's important." His expression tightened. "Is she okay? She's safe. I've noticed some things, and I think we need to discuss them. Privately." He studied her for a long moment. "Tonight, after she's asleep. My study." Claire nodded. He left, and she sat alone in the kitchen with her cold coffee and the weight of what she was about to do. The day passed in slow agony. Claire went through the motions. Breakfast with Sophie, art projects, reading, a walk in the garden when the rain cleared. While inside, she rehearsed the conversation 100 different ways. Victoria breezed through the house around noon, shopping bags rustling, phone pressed to her ear. She barely acknowledged Claire except for a glance that managed to convey both dismissal and surveillance simultaneously. "I'm making Sophie's smoothie," Victoria announced, entering the kitchen at 3 o'clock. She said it casually, the way someone might announce they were checking the mail. Claire watched from the doorway. Victoria moved with practiced ease. Frozen berries, banana, almond milk, a scoop from the glass jar. She blended it, poured it into Sophie's favorite cup, the one with the unicorn, and added a pink straw. "I'll take it to her," Claire said. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "I usually bring it myself. She's in the middle of a drawing. I'll make sure she drinks it." For a moment, something passed behind Victoria's perfectly composed face, a flicker of calculation, of assessment. Then she smiled. "Of course. You're the nanny after all." Claire took the smoothie. She walked halfway down the hall, then turned into the downstairs bathroom. She locked the door, pulled a small Ziploc bag from her pocket and poured half the smoothie into it. She sealed it, tucked it into her bag, then poured some water into the cup to maintain the level. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. She brought the cup to Sophie. From Victoria. Sophie looked at it with the resigned acceptance of a child who'd been told something was good for her too many times to argue. She took a sip. "You don't have to drink it all," Claire said gently. "Just a little bit, okay?" Sophie nodded and set the cup aside, returning to her drawing. It was a family picture. A tall figure with dark hair, a small figure with brown eyes, and between them, a woman with a low bun and a kind face. "Who's that?" Claire asked, pointing to the woman. "That's you," Sophie said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Claire's throat tightened. She sat beside Sophie and helped her color the sky. At 9 o'clock, with Sophie asleep and the house quiet, Claire knocked on the study door. "Come in." Nathan was behind his desk, jacket off, tie loosened, the lamplight casting warm shadows across his face. He looked tired but alert, a man who sensed that the conversation ahead wasn't going to be simple. "Sit down," he said. Not a command this time, an invitation. Claire sat. She placed her notebook on her lap and took a breath. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you react. Can you do that?" Nathan leaned back in his chair. "You sound like you're about to deliver very bad news." "I might be." His jaw tightened. "Go ahead." "I've been tracking Sophie's symptoms since my first day. I created a detailed log. What she eats, when, how she feels before and after each meal, what activities she does, who she's with." She opened the notebook and placed it on his desk. "Look at the pattern." Nathan pulled the notebook toward him. His eyes moved across the pages, the neat columns, the color-coded entries, the meticulous documentation that belonged in a medical chart, not a nanny's personal record. "The pain episodes correlate almost perfectly with one specific variable," Claire continued. "Sophie's symptoms are worst on days when she consumes the afternoon smoothie, the smoothie Victoria makes." Nathan's face went very still. It was the stillness of a man who processed information before he reacted, the boardroom instinct overriding the emotional one. "That's a serious implication," he said carefully. "I know. You're suggesting that my fiancé is somehow responsible for my daughter's illness. I'm suggesting that there's a correlation that needs investigation. The probiotic supplement Victoria adds to the smoothie. I don't recognize it. It's not from any brand I can identify. And the symptoms Sophie exhibits are consistent with low-dose exposure to certain compounds that wouldn't show up on standard pediatric panels." Nathan stared at her. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. "How would you know what shows up on standard pediatric panels?" And there it was, the question she'd been dreading since the moment she walked into this house. Claire held his gaze. "Because before I was a nanny, I was a doctor, a pediatric resident at Johns Hopkins, and I lost everything because I tried to save a child's life. And the wrong person decided that made me a threat." Nathan didn't move. He didn't blink. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily into the silence. "I have a sample of the smoothie," Claire said. "I took it today. If you have it analyzed by an independent lab, the results will tell us whether I'm wrong or right. But Nathan, I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, my career, the people I trusted, but I have never been wrong about a sick child." The rain had started again. She could hear it against the windows, soft and relentless. Nathan looked down at the notebook. Then he looked at her, not at the nanny, not at the employee, but at the woman sitting across from him who had just handed him a grenade and trusted him not to throw it back at her. "If you're right," he said slowly, "then the woman sleeping upstairs in my bedroom has been poisoning my daughter. Yes. And if you're wrong, you've just destroyed any trust between us. I know that too." He stood up and walked to the window. For a long time, he said nothing. The rain ran down the glass in silver threads, and the city lights blurred behind it like a painting left in the rain. "I'll have the sample tested," he said finally without turning around. "Tomorrow. Private lab? No questions asked." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, a storm held behind glass. "You lied to me, Claire. About who you are, about your qualifications, about everything." "I know. And you expect me to trust you now?" Claire stood. "I expect you to trust the evidence, Nathan. That's all I've ever asked anyone to do. It didn't work out for me last time, but your daughter's health is worth the risk of it not working out again." She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," she said quietly. "I didn't want to be anything other than what I am. Sometimes life takes that choice away from you." She left the study and closed the door behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall and pressed her palm over her mouth to stop the sound that was trying to escape. Something between a sob and a laugh, the sound of a woman who had just set fire to the only safe place she had left, and didn't know if anything would survive the flames. Inside the study, Nathan Blackwell stood alone in the lamplight, holding a notebook full of evidence that either proved his nanny was brilliant or his fiancée was a monster. He was terrified of which one it would turn out to be. The lab results came back on Wednesday. Nathan sat in his car in the parking garage beneath Blackwell Industries for 17 minutes before he could bring himself to open the envelope. His driver had already asked twice if everything was all right. Nathan had sent him away. The garage was concrete and fluorescent light and the distant hum of ventilation systems. It smelled like motor oil and cold stone. Nathan tore the seal, unfolded the single sheet of paper and read the findings once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change what was printed there. Ipecac syrup, low concentration, dissolved into a fruit and probiotic matrix, consistent with repeated small-dose oral administration. Ipecac, a substance once used to induce vomiting in poison cases, long since removed from medical recommendations because of the damage it caused: nausea, abdominal cramping, weakness, dehydration. In small, sustained doses given to a 42-pound child, it would produce exactly the symptoms Sophie had been suffering for months. Nathan set the paper on the passenger seat. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands and stared at the concrete wall in front of him. His knuckles went white, his vision blurred, and he realized he was crying, silently, without movement, the way men cry when they've been taught that tears are a structural failure. Victoria, the woman he'd brought into his home, the woman who slept beside him, who kissed his daughter's forehead, who smiled at fundraisers with her hand on his arm while cameras flashed, the woman who, for 5 months, had been feeding poison to his child. He thought of Sophie, the small body curled around her stuffed rabbit, the quiet crying she did alone at 2 in the morning, the way she said, "My tummy is angry," as if pain were just weather, something you waited out. A sound escaped him, low, guttural, something between rage and grief. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel and let it move through him, the full force of a betrayal so intimate it felt like surgery performed without anesthesia. Then he straightened. He dried his face with the back of his hand. He folded the lab report, placed it inside his jacket, and started the car. He had work to do. Nathan called his attorney from the road. Richard Calloway had represented the Blackwell family for 23 years and had seen everything from hostile takeovers to paternity disputes. Even he went silent for a full 10 seconds when Nathan told him what the lab results showed. "Don't confront her yet," Richard said. "We need this handled surgically. If she suspects you know, she could destroy evidence, fabricate a defense, or worse, claim Claire tampered with the sample. Claire didn't tamper with anything. I know that. A judge might not. We need the original supplement jar tested by a certified forensic lab with proper chain of custody. I'll have my investigator at your house within the hour. Can you keep Victoria away?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "She has a dress fitting at 2. She'll be gone until 5. That's our window. Nathan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead." "Is there any reason Victoria would want Sophie sick? Financial, custodial, personal?" Nathan stared at the road. The question landed like a blade between his ribs, and the worst part was that the answer came to him immediately, clear and terrible and obvious in hindsight. "My will," he said. "Sophie is my sole heir. If something happened to her, if she were declared medically unfit or placed in long-term care, Victoria, as my spouse, would become the primary beneficiary." Richard exhaled slowly. "We're not just looking at child endangerment, Nathan. This could be attempted murder by degrees." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Get the investigator to my house," Nathan said. "I'll handle the rest." He ended the call and drove the rest of the way in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind already mapping the sequence of what came next with the same ruthless precision he applied to corporate acquisitions. Except this time the asset he was protecting wasn't a company. It was everything. Claire was in Sophie's room when Nathan arrived home at 1:15. She was teaching Sophie to fold paper cranes, a skill she'd learned from a Japanese roommate during her first year of medical school, though Sophie didn't know that part. She heard the front door open. She heard his footsteps, faster than usual, heavier. She knew before he appeared in the doorway. "Claire," a word. Sophie looked up. "Hi, Daddy. Look, I made a bird." Nathan's expression transformed instantly, the storm behind his eyes vanishing, replaced by something so tender it made Claire's chest ache. He knelt beside his daughter and examined the slightly lopsided paper crane with the seriousness of a museum curator appraising a masterwork. "That's beautiful, Butterfly. Can I keep it?" "It's for your desk. Claire says paper cranes grant wishes." "Is that so?" He looked at Claire. The tenderness was still there, but beneath it she could see the other thing. The knowledge, the fury, the devastation. "That's the legend," Claire said quietly. 1,000 cranes, one wish. We've only made 7. Sophie pointed out. Then we have 993 to go. Nathan kissed the top of his daughter's head. Keep practicing. I need to talk to Claire for a minute. In the hallway with Sophie's door closed behind them, the mask fell away. Nathan's face was the face of a man standing in the wreckage of something he'd trusted. You were right, he said. He reached inside his jacket and handed her the lab report. Claire read it. She'd known in her bones. But seeing it confirmed in clinical black and white was different. It was the difference between suspecting a fire and smelling the smoke. Ipecac, she whispered. Low dose, sustained administration. That's why the standard panels missed it. They weren't looking for it. Richard Calloway, my attorney, he's sending a forensic investigator to test the original jar. Victoria will be out of the house from 2 to 5. Claire nodded. Her clinical mind was already working. Dosage calculations, duration of exposure, potential long-term effects on Sophie's digestive system. But her heart, the part of her that had held Sophie's hand at 2 in the morning and heard, "Are you going to leave too?" Her heart was screaming. Has Sophie had the smoothie today? Nathan asked. No. I told Victoria that Sophie had a late lunch and wasn't hungry for a snack. Victoria wasn't pleased, but she didn't push. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were clear and hard. I want Victoria out of this house. Tonight. Richard said not to confront her yet. I know what Richard said. His voice was barely controlled. But every hour that woman is under the same roof as my daughter is an hour too many. Claire reached out and touched his arm. It was the first time she'd touched him. Deliberately, intentionally. And they both felt it. The contact was brief, her fingers light against his forearm, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. Nathan, listen to me. If you confront Victoria now before the forensic evidence is secured, she could claim the jar was contaminated. She could destroy evidence. She could turn this into a credibility battle, her word against mine, and I'm a disgraced doctor working as a nanny. We both know how that story plays in court. He stared at her. The muscle in his jaw worked. She could see the war inside him. The father who wanted to drag Victoria out by her designer collar versus the strategist who knew Claire was right. 48 hours, he said finally. That's all I can give. 48 hours of watching that woman smile at my daughter across the dinner table. After that, I don't care what Richard says. 48 hours, Claire agreed. He looked down at where her hand still rested on his arm. Neither of them moved. You saved her life, Claire. Not yet, but I intend to. He nodded once, turned, and walked toward his study. At the end of the hallway, he stopped. The crane. Sophie said you told her they grant wishes. It's a Japanese tradition. Senbazuru. What would you wish for? If you had 1,000? Claire looked at him standing there in the dim hallway. This man who was breaking apart and holding himself together simultaneously. And she knew the answer but couldn't say it. Not yet. Not while his daughter was still in danger and his fiancé was still wearing a ring. And the truth about Claire's past was still an open wound. Ask me again when this is over, she said. He held her gaze for one long moment, then disappeared into his study. The investigator came and went. The jar was collected, photographed, catalogued, and transported to a forensic laboratory in Cambridge with a strict chain of custody protocol. Richard filed a preliminary report with the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. A family court judge was contacted for an emergency protective order. The machinery of justice was in motion, and all Nathan and Claire could do was wait. Those 48 hours were the longest of Claire's life. She watched Victoria pour orange juice at breakfast and had to force herself not to flinch. She listened to Victoria tell Sophie that her smoothie was waiting in the fridge and redirected with every excuse she could invent. Sophie had a stomachache already. Sophie had eaten too much at lunch. Sophie wanted apple juice instead. Victoria noticed. Of course she noticed. On the second evening, she cornered Claire in the laundry room. You've been interfering with Sophie's routine, Victoria said. Her voice was pleasant. Her eyes were not. I've been adjusting her diet based on her symptoms. That's my job. Your job is to follow the schedule I set. The smoothies are part of her health protocol. With respect, Victoria, I answered to Nathan. Something flickered behind Victoria's composure. Brief, razor sharp, and immediately concealed. Of course you do. Just remember, Claire, nannies come and go in this house. I'm the one who stays. She smiled, turned on her heel, and left. Her perfume lingered in the small room like a warning. That night, Claire sat in her room and stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Nathan. I got your number from the personnel file. Forensic results confirmed. Ipecac. Same compound, same concentration. Richard is moving forward. Emergency hearing tomorrow at 9. She typed back, "How are you?" A long pause. Then, "I'm sitting in my daughter's room watching her sleep and trying to understand how I let this happen." Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to type so many things. That it wasn't his fault. That predators were skilled at concealment. That loving someone didn't make you responsible for their deception. Instead, she wrote, "You didn't let anything happen. You trusted someone. That's not a flaw, Nathan. It's what makes you human." Another pause. Longer this time. "Thank you, Claire. For everything. For being what Sophie needed when I couldn't see what was right in front of me." She set the phone on her nightstand and turned off the light. In the darkness, she pressed her hand against her chest and felt her heart beating. Steady, certain, terrified, and allowed herself for just one moment to acknowledge what was growing there. Not just concern for Sophie, not just professional determination, something deeper, something dangerous, something that had no place in the middle of a crisis but existed anyway, stubbornly, irrationally, like a paper crane folded from fire. She was falling in love with Nathan Blackwell, and the timing could not possibly have been worse. The emergency hearing took place at 9 a.m. in the Suffolk County Family Court, a building that smelled like floor wax and desperation. Nathan sat beside Richard Calloway at the petitioner's table, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly income, and an expression that cost him everything. Across the aisle, Victoria's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Diane Pruitt who specialized in defending the indefensible, shuffled papers with practiced calm. Victoria herself sat behind her attorney in a cream blazer and pearl earrings, the picture of composed innocence. She hadn't looked at Nathan once since entering the courtroom. She hadn't needed to. Her entire posture was a performance of the bewildered fiancée, the concerned stepmother-to-be, the woman wrongly accused. Claire sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, wearing the same navy blue dress she'd worn to her medical board hearing 2 years ago. She'd considered this ironic. She'd also considered throwing up. Judge Patricia Harmon, a silver-haired woman with reading glasses perched on her nose and 30 years of family law behind her eyes, reviewed the forensic report, the medical records, Claire's symptom log, and the toxicologist's expert statement. She took 11 minutes. It felt like 11 hours. "The court finds sufficient evidence to issue a temporary emergency protective order," Judge Harmon announced. "Ms. Lane is to have no contact with the minor child, Sophie Blackwell, effective immediately. She is to vacate the Blackwell residence within 24 hours and surrender her keys and access credentials." Victoria's composure cracked. Not dramatically. She wasn't the dramatic type. It was subtle. A tightening of her fingers around her clutch, a slight narrowing of her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift from victim to something colder. "This is absurd," she said, loud enough for the gallery to hear. "That woman, that nanny, she planted this. She's been manipulating Nathan since the day she arrived. Ms. Lane," Judge Harmon's voice carried the weight of a gavel without needing one, "you will address the court through your attorney." Diane Pruitt placed a hand on Victoria's arm. Victoria shook it off and stood, turning to face Nathan directly for the first time. "You're going to believe a disgraced doctor over me?" Her voice was low, controlled, and venomous. "A woman who lost her medical license? A woman who lied about who she was to get into your house?" Nathan didn't flinch. He looked at Victoria, the woman he'd proposed to at a restaurant in the Back Bay, the woman he'd imagined raising his daughter alongside, the woman he'd trusted with the most precious thing in his world. And what he felt wasn't anger. Not anymore. Anger had burned through him in the parking garage on Wednesday. What remained was something colder and sadder, the quiet devastation of understanding exactly how wrong you can be about a person. "I believe the evidence, Victoria," he said, "and I believe my daughter." Victoria's eyes flashed. For one unguarded moment, the mask slipped completely, and what Claire saw underneath made her blood run cold. Not rage, not desperation, but calculation. Pure, mechanical calculation, as if Victoria were already computing her next move, her next angle, her next performance. Then the mask returned. Victoria sat down, whispered something to her attorney, and said nothing more. The hearing concluded in 40 minutes. The protective order was granted. A criminal investigation was formally opened. Nathan walked out of the courthouse into the pale October sunlight and stood on the steps with his hands in his pockets, staring at the street below. Richard was talking about next steps, criminal charges, civil liability, media containment, but Nathan wasn't listening. He was thinking about Sophie's paper crane, sitting on the corner of his desk. He was thinking about 1,000 cranes and one wish. Nathan. He turned. Claire stood a few feet behind him, her face drawn, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She'd held herself together through the entire hearing with the composure of someone who had survived a courtroom before and knew that tears were a currency best spent in private. "It's over?" he asked. "The first part is over," she said. "The hardest part comes next." She was right. Victoria vacated the brownstone the following morning with 2 suitcases, a storage company on standby, and a parting comment to Margaret that landed like a slap. "You should be careful," Victoria told Nathan's mother in the foyer, her voice silk over steel. "That woman you're all so eager to trust? She's a fraud. Ask her about Dr. Marcus Webb. Ask her what really happened at Johns Hopkins." Margaret, to her credit, said nothing. She simply held the door open and waited for Victoria to walk through it. When the door closed, Margaret turned to Claire, who was standing at the top of the stairs. "I intend to ask," Margaret said, "but not today. Today, we focus on Sophie." Claire nodded. The reprieve was temporary and she knew it. The full truth about her past was coming whether she controlled the telling or not. It came that evening. Nathan found her in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench beneath the old maple tree, wrapped in a cardigan, watching the last light fade over the rooftops. The air smelled like fallen leaves and approaching winter. He sat beside her without asking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria mentioned a name, he said. Marcus Webb. Claire exhaled slowly. She'd been expecting this since the courtroom, since the moment Victoria had aimed the words "disgraced doctor," like a weapon designed to destroy the one person who had dismantled her scheme. "Marcus Webb was my attending physician during my 3rd year of residency at Johns Hopkins," Claire began. Her voice was steady, practiced in the way of someone who had told this story to lawyers and review boards but never to someone who mattered. A 3-year-old boy named Elijah Carter was admitted to the pediatric emergency department with symptoms that didn't fit any standard diagnosis. Recurrent vomiting, intermittent fever, failure to thrive. Sound familiar? Nathan's expression tightened. I pushed for expanded metabolic testing. Dr. Webb refused. He'd already made his diagnosis. Cyclical vomiting syndrome. And he didn't appreciate a resident contradicting him. I ordered the tests anyway, on my own authority, which I technically didn't have. Were you right? Elijah had a rare urea cycle disorder. Without treatment, he would have gone into hyperammonemic crisis within 48 hours. He would have suffered irreversible brain damage or died. So you saved his life. Yes, and Dr. Webb couldn't forgive that. Claire's hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. He filed a formal complaint. He said I'd acted recklessly, ordered unauthorized procedures, and endangered the patient by delaying his treatment plan. The hospital's legal team looked at the liability exposure of a resident acting without authorization and decided that supporting Webb was safer than supporting me. They fired you. They terminated my residency. The medical board investigated. They didn't find wrongdoing. Technically, I was cleared, but the investigation itself was enough. No residency program would accept a transfer with an active board inquiry on her record. By the time the investigation closed, 18 months had passed. I'd lost my position, my apartment, my fiancé, a surgeon named David who decided that a disgraced resident wasn't compatible with his career trajectory and any realistic path back to medicine. She paused. The garden was dark now, except for the light spilling from the kitchen windows. I became a nanny because I still needed to be near children. I still needed to help. It was the only way I could use what I knew without the credentials the world had taken from me. She looked at Nathan. I didn't lie to hurt you, Nathan. I lied because the truth had already destroyed my life once and I couldn't afford to let it happen again. Nathan was silent for a long time. The wind stirred the branches above them, sending a few last leaves spiraling to the ground. The fiancé, he said quietly. David. He left 3 weeks after the investigation started. He said he needed to protect his reputation. He was an idiot. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the emotion, the rawness of the wound she'd just reopened, Claire felt something loosen in her chest. Not quite a laugh, but the ghost of one. He was pragmatic, she said. The medical world is small. Association with a scandal is career poison. He was still an idiot. Nathan turned to face her. In the dim light, his eyes were very green and very serious. You gave up everything to save a child you barely knew. You did it again with Sophie. That's not recklessness, Claire. That's who you are. Not everyone sees it that way. I do. The words landed between them with the weight of something irrevocable. Claire felt tears building behind her eyes. Not the clinical, controlled tears she'd mastered during depositions, but the messy, uncontainable kind that came from being seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion had come to matter more than she'd ever intended. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. Nathan reached over and took her hand. His fingers were warm, his grip firm and gentle at the same time, the hands of a man who built empires but was learning slowly that the most important things couldn't be acquired or controlled. "What happens next," he said, "is that we make sure Sophie is safe. We make sure Victoria answers for what she did. And then, when the dust settles and the lawyers stop calling and my daughter can eat a meal without being afraid of her own stomach, then I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as your employer, not as Sophie's father. As a man who has spent the last 3 weeks trying very hard not to fall in love with the most extraordinary woman he's ever met, and failing completely." Claire looked at their intertwined hands. A tear slid down her cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. "You're proposing dinner while there's an active criminal investigation involving your household. Is that a no? It's an observation about your timing. My timing has always been terrible. Ask anyone in my company." She laughed. It was small and broken and beautiful, and Nathan realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh, really laugh, and it sounded like something he wanted to hear every day for the rest of his life. "When the dust settles," she said. "Dinner. When the dust settles." He didn't let go of her hand. They sat together on the stone bench beneath the maple tree while the city hummed around them, and the first stars appeared over Boston, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt like something worth reaching for. 3 months changed everything. The criminal investigation moved with the deliberate pace of justice, slow enough to be agonizing, thorough enough to be devastating. Victoria Lane was formally charged with felony child endangerment and assault on a minor. The prosecution's case was built on the forensic evidence, Claire's documented symptom log, pharmacy records showing Victoria had purchased ipecac syrup online under a false name, and digital correspondence recovered from Victoria's phone in which she discussed Sophie's ongoing health issues with a financial advisor who had been helping her understand the terms of Nathan's estate plan. The correspondence was damning. In one message, Victoria had written, "The longer the medical issues persist, the stronger the case for a medical trust. If something were to happen to N, guardianship and financial control would naturally fall to me as his spouse." The clinical detachment of the language, "if something were to happen," made Nathan physically ill when he read it. Victoria's defense team attempted 3 strategies in sequence. First, that Claire had fabricated the evidence out of jealousy. Second, that the ipecac was a holistic remedy Victoria had been using in good faith on the advice of an unregulated wellness practitioner. And third, that Victoria's mental health had been compromised by the pressures of her relationship with Nathan. None of them held. The forensic chain of custody was unimpeachable. The wellness practitioner turned out to be a fiction. No such person existed. And the mental health defense collapsed when the prosecution presented Victoria's financial planning correspondence, which demonstrated sustained, calculated premeditation entirely incompatible with a mental health crisis. Victoria Lane pleaded no contest to the charges in January. She was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. Nathan sat in the courtroom when the sentence was read. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He felt the quiet, devastating weight of having loved someone who had never loved him back, who had, in fact, never loved anything except the architecture of her own ambition. Claire sat beside him. She didn't touch him. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough, steady, certain, the gravity that kept him from spinning into the dark. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Nathan turned to her. "It's over," he said. "Yes, you know what that means." Claire looked at him. The January wind was sharp against her face, and her cheeks were pink and her eyes were clear. "It means you owe me dinner." The dinner happened on a Friday in February, at a small Italian restaurant in the North End that Nathan had chosen specifically because it had no valet parking, no dress code, and no chance of appearing in a society column. Claire wore a green dress she'd bought with the first paycheck she hadn't spent on rent or groceries. Nathan wore a navy sweater. No suit, no tie, no armor. He looked like a different person, and in many ways he was. They sat across from each other in a corner booth with a candle between them that kept flickering in the draft from the kitchen, and for the first time, they talked. Not about Sophie's health or legal proceedings or forensic reports. They talked about everything else. She told him about growing up in a small town in Vermont, the the daughter of a schoolteacher and a librarian, about how she'd decided to become a doctor at age 9 after watching her grandmother die of a heart attack in their living room and feeling the helpless fury of not knowing what to do, about the years of study, the sacrifices, the single-minded determination that had carried her to Johns Hopkins and then, just as ruthlessly, had been used against her. He told her about growing up in the shadow of his father's legacy, Harrison Blackwell, who had built the company from nothing and died of a heart attack at 58, leaving behind a fortune, a corporation, and a son who measured his own worth by quarterly earnings because he didn't know any other metric. About his marriage to Sophie's mother, Lydia, a woman who had been beautiful and restless and ultimately incapable of the kind of stillness that parenthood required. About the morning he'd woken to find Lydia gone, a note on the kitchen counter, and a 14-month-old daughter crying in the next room. I built walls after that, he said, turning his wine glass slowly. Around the company, around Sophie, around myself. I thought if I controlled everything, nothing could hurt us again. And then you hired a nanny, who turned out to be a doctor, who blew up your entire life. I prefer to think of it as a strategic renovation. Claire smiled. The candle flickered. The restaurant hummed with the sounds of other people's conversations, other people's lives, and for a moment, the world felt manageable, small and warm and possible. Nathan reached across the table and took her hand. I need to ask you something. If it's about my medical credentials, Richard already has the paperwork. It's not about your credentials. He paused, and she saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Not the CEO, not the father, not the man in crisis. Nervousness, genuine, unguarded vulnerability. Stay. I'm still eating my pasta. Not at the restaurant, Claire. Stay at the house with us, not as a nanny. Sophie's health has improved dramatically since Victoria left. She doesn't need a full-time medical caretaker anymore. But she needs you. And he stopped, looked down at their hands, looked up. I need you. I have needed you since the morning you stood in my kitchen at 5 a.m. and told me that my daughter shouldn't have to wait for pain to pass alone. Claire felt the tears come and let them. She'd spent 2 years learning not to cry, in courtrooms, in job interviews, in her small apartment where the walls were thin and the neighbors were close, and she was tired of it. She was tired of performing strength when what she wanted was to be soft, to be held, to be seen by someone who understood that courage and vulnerability were not opposites but the same thing, viewed from different angles. I'm terrified, she said. The last time I trusted someone with my real self, he left. The last time I told the truth, it cost me everything. I'm not David and I'm not the medical board. I know, that's what terrifies me. Nathan stood up, walked around to her side of the booth and sat beside her. He cupped her face in both hands and looked at her with an intensity that made the restaurant, the city, the entire world outside this booth, dissolve into irrelevance. I'm asking you to trust me, he said. Not blindly, not the way I trusted Victoria. Trust me the way you trusted the evidence. With your eyes open and your mind clear and the knowledge that what you're looking at is real. He kissed her. It was the first time and it was gentle and firm and tasted like red wine and honesty. And Claire kissed him back with everything she had. Every year of loss, every night of doubt, every morning she'd told herself that this life was enough, knowing it wasn't. When they pulled apart, her face was wet and her heart was full and the candle was still flickering in the draft, stubborn and bright. Was that a yes? Nathan asked. That was your timing is still terrible, but also a yes. Also a yes. Spring came to Boston the way it always does, reluctantly, then all at once. The brownstone on Louisburg Square transformed under Claire's presence in ways that had nothing to do with decorating and everything to do with warmth. Sophie recovered, not overnight and not without setbacks. The damage from 5 months of ipecac exposure required careful medical monitoring, dietary rehabilitation, and the patient work of a gastroenterologist who happened to be one of Claire's former classmates from Hopkins. But by March, Sophie was eating full meals. By April, the stomach aches had stopped. By May, she was running through the public garden chasing ducks with the boundless energy of a child who had forgotten what it felt like to hurt. Claire's medical career was resurrected with the help of an unexpected ally. Margaret Blackwell, the woman who had greeted Claire's arrival with glacial skepticism and her revelation with stony silence, had spent 20 years on the board of Massachusetts General Hospital. She made 3 phone calls, one of which was to the chief of pediatric medicine, and another to a member of the State Medical Board Review Committee. You saved my granddaughter's life, Margaret told Claire one morning over coffee, with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman settling a debt. I pay my debts. The medical community in this city listens to the Blackwell name, and it's long past time that name was used for something better than fundraiser invitations. Within 2 months, Claire's case was formally reopened and reviewed. Dr. Marcus Webb, confronted with the renewed scrutiny, quietly resigned from Johns Hopkins rather than face a full investigation into his pattern of retaliatory complaints against subordinates, a pattern that, once Claire's case broke open, revealed 3 other residents who had suffered similar fates. All 3 were offered reinstatement. Claire's medical license was fully restored in June. She cried in the bathroom of the Suffolk County Administrative Building, then walked out into the sunshine and called Nathan. "Dr. Morgan," he answered. She could hear his smile through the phone. "How does it feel?" "Like coming home to a house I thought had burned down." "That might be the most poetic thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it." She started her new position at Boston Children's Hospital in July, a pediatric attending, not a resident, because the review board determined that her clinical skills and diagnostic record more than qualified her for the advancement she'd been denied. On her first day, she wore a white coat with her name embroidered above the pocket, Dr. Claire Morgan, and stood in the hospital corridor for a full minute, touching the stitching with her fingertips, letting the reality of it sink in. Then she went to work, because there were children who needed her, and she'd already wasted 2 years pretending to be less than she was. Nathan proposed on a Saturday in September. He'd planned something elaborate. Of course he had. He was Nathan Blackwell, and elaborate was his default setting. There was supposed to be a private dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, followed by a walk through the public garden, where he'd arranged for a string quartet to be playing near the footbridge. Sophie ruined it. Beautifully. She found the ring box in his jacket pocket at 3 in the afternoon, while looking for his car keys to play road trip with her stuffed animals. She burst into the living room holding it aloft, like a trophy. "Daddy, is this a ring for Claire?" Nathan, who was on a conference call with Tokyo, dropped his phone. Claire, who was in the kitchen reviewing patient files, heard Sophie's announcement through 2 closed doors and an entire floor of 19th century construction. Margaret, who was reading in the library, simply turned a page and said, "Finally." Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his conference call forgotten, his elaborate plan in ruins, and his 6-year-old daughter standing behind him holding an open ring box with the triumphant glee of a tiny detective who had cracked the case. "This is not how I planned this," Nathan said. Claire looked at him, disheveled, panicked, completely stripped of every defense he'd ever built, and felt a wave of love so enormous it made her dizzy. "How did you plan it?" "String quartet, footbridge, sunset. That does sound very you. It was going to be romantic." "This is romantic," Sophie declared, climbing onto a kitchen stool. "Say yes, Claire. Then we can have cake." Nathan looked at his daughter, then at Claire. He crossed the kitchen, took the ring box from Sophie, and got down on one knee on the Italian tile floor, between the refrigerator and the island, with his daughter watching from her stool and his mother appearing in the doorway with a rare, genuine smile. "Claire Morgan, you walked into my house pretending to be a nanny, diagnosed my daughter, dismantled my fiancé, restored my faith in humanity, and made me fall in love with you so completely that I can't remember what my life was like before you were in it." He opened the box. The diamond caught the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window. "Will you marry me?" "You're proposing in the kitchen. I had a whole speech prepared for the garden. I'd rather hear it here, where the real stuff happens." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes, Nathan." He slid the ring onto her finger, stood up and kissed her while Sophie clapped and cheered, and Margaret quietly took a photograph on the phone she claimed she didn't know how to use. They married in October, 1 year to the day after Claire had first walked through the front door of the Lewisburg Square brownstone. The ceremony was small, 40 guests in the garden under the maple tree where Nathan had first held her hand. Sophie was the flower girl, and she took the job with a seriousness that suggested she was preparing for a future career in event management. Margaret read a poem she'd written herself, which surprised everyone because Margaret Blackwell was not known for sentimentality. She cried during the last stanza, which surprised everyone even more. She blamed the wind. Richard Calloway served as best man and gave a toast that referenced Nathan's history of terrible decisions, finally broken by one spectacularly good one. Thomas the chef catered the reception with a menu Claire had helped design. Simple, wholesome, beautiful. Sophie ate 3 plates of pasta and declared it the best wedding ever, a judgment based on a sample size of 1 but delivered with absolute authority. That evening, After the guests had gone and Sophie was asleep upstairs with Gerald the stuffed rabbit and a crown of flowers still tangled in her hair, Nathan and Claire stood in the garden. The fairy lights strung through the maple tree cast warm constellations across the grass, and the October air carried the smell of fallen leaves and beginning. 1,000 cranes, Nathan said. We only made it to 212. Close enough. He pulled her close. What's your wish? Claire looked up at the lights, at the old brownstone that had become her home, at the windows behind which a little girl slept peacefully for the first time in a year, and at the man who had torn down every wall he'd built to let her in. I already have it, she said. He kissed her forehead. She closed her eyes. And in the quiet of the Boston evening, in a garden where the truth had been spoken and the walls had come down, Claire Morgan Blackwell finally understood that home was not a place you found. It was a person who found you.